Welcome back to the TRT World Forum. I'm Melinda Nusafora, TRT World correspondent and moderator for this session, Multipolarity in the Age of Covid-19, the Future of Global Solidarity. As the COVID-19 pandemic swept the globe, individuals were encouraged to isolate and countries resorted to isolationism. Nationalism, already on the rise in much of the world, was amplified, and traditional mechanisms of regional and international cooperation appeared unable to deal with the crisis. During this session, we'll discuss the future of international cooperation and multilateralism through the prism of the COVID-19 pandemic. We'll explore how institutions can reshape their activities to better address this immense collective challenge the world is facing. Joining us on today's panel, we have Bisera Turkovic, Bosnia and Herzegovina Minister for Foreign Affairs. Margaritas Skinas, the Vice President of the European Commission. Joseph Nye, Professor Emeritus and former Dean of the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. Parag Khanna, the founder and managing partner of strategic advisory firm FutureMap, and Ibrahim Kalin, spokesman for the President of the Republic of Turkey. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us here at the TRT World Forum 2020. Mr. Ibrahim Kalin, I'm going to address my first question to you, sir. The concepts of globalization, multilateralism, and international cooperation have increasingly been called into question amid this COVID-19 pandemic. In the wake of the pandemic, has the way we think about globalization and our approach to multilateralism changed forever?
Thank you very much. I want to thank everyone, first of all, for putting this panel together, which is very timely. But I want to take issue first with the title, Post-Pandemic World. I don't think we are there yet. We very much hope to be there soon with the vaccination found and made available to everyone. But we are living a truly global moment, I think, for the first time in a long time, in the sense that everybody is affected by one incident in the world. We've had cases.
We seem to have a slight problem there with Mr. Cullen's connection. So we're going to continue on. I'm going to address my next question to Joseph Nye, and we will come back to Ibrahim Cullen once we've got his connection resecured. Joseph Nye, the Professor Emeritus and former Dean of the Kennedy School of Governance at Harvard University. We may not be post-pandemic. If you agree, as I'm sure many of you do, with Mr. Cullen, we are still very well and truly within this pandemic, but it's arguably accelerated a trend whereby the legitimacy of the international system has increasingly been called into question. Given this, and given our current circumstance still amid this pandemic, what does the future hold, do you believe, for multilateralism and international cooperation?
We have seen a shock to the system as a whole, but I think, if anything, we've learned that rather than decoupling and isolation and so forth, that there are some areas where we're going to be more tightly coupled. It's true that on some of the economic globalization that the world has seen, there has been more concern about security when it comes to supply chains. So in that sense, just in case is going to replace just in time. But that will be a matter of degree, not a total reduction of international trade. And one should also remember that there are two types of globalization, at least two: economic globalization, which we've referred to, but also ecological globalization, which is interdependence at intercontinental distances. And there, if anything, the pandemic has showed that we're more tightly coupled and will increasingly be tightly coupled. Alas, this is not the last pandemic. And also, alas, we're on a path in climate change where we're seeing carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases crossing borders without any concern about nationality, just the way viruses cross borders without any concern about the humans that they kill. So I think in that sense, we're learning that we have no escape. In my new book, Do Morals Matter, I distinguish between two types of power: power over others, the traditional type of competition, and power with others, where we can't solve a problem unless we work with others. And both the examples I gave of ecological globalization, climate change, and pandemics are great illustrations. I do think that there's been a shock to the system, but I don't think it's set us back to isolation. I think it's dramatized the importance of closer cooperation. And with the Biden government announcing that it'll rejoin the Paris Climate Accords and the World Health Organization, I think you're seeing signs of that in the United States.
I'm going to come back to Biden and also to climate change, two very interesting points that you've raised there a little bit later in our session. But before we get there, I want to maybe take a little bit of a look at the EU specifically. So, Bisera Turkovic, let me address this question to you. How has interstate cooperation between the Balkan states and then cooperation between the Balkans and the rest of Europe been impacted, do you think, during the pandemic?
Okay, now I believe you hear
All
me.
right,
Thank you. Right, I got your question, so I can go with the answer. Well, I confidently believe that the interstate cooperation between the EU and the Western Balkan, where Bosnia and Herzegovina belongs to, still remains a very relevant topic. Um, for us, it includes many aspects like digital connectivity and networking, enhancing businesses, cultural exchange, fostering ties between youth, and so on. The connectivity is also linked to the process of bringing our lives to the pre-pandemic state of affairs. EU and regional connectivity in the Western Balkans can thus be seen as a precondition for a fast economic growth, modernization, sustainable development goals, implementation, and the overall prosperity of the citizens of Southeastern Europe. Globalization can involve foreign direct investment, economic growth, and shrink the existing economic gaps. Of course, many things could be done regionally and with stronger involvement of the national government. But we in Western Balkan very much depend on support of EU, and I think that EU responded quite well considering the situation in which countries of the Western Balkan found themselves.
let's stay within the European continent. And Margaritis Skinas, Vice President of the European Commission, what about you? How do you think the EU has weathered this COVID storm?
Between the first weeks of the pandemic, where many governments, I think, both within the EU but also beyond the EU, reacted in a way that was uncoordinated under the pressure of public opinion, and they tried to face an unprecedented event. But very quickly, I think our governments in the European Union realized how much they have in common: the interdependence of our economies, the fact that Europe has the biggest and better regulated single market in the world, that our supply chains are totally integrated. So, very quickly, we switched to coordination mode, and I think the EU institutions from Brussels were instrumental in fostering this cooperation. We went very quickly to coordinating borders, introducing green lanes to supply our supermarkets. We organized common tenders to buy personal protective equipment for everyone. We tried to reaffirm the European Union as a union. And there was a third phase in which we find ourselves now, which is the phase of unprecedented cooperation and integration of what we do together as Europeans. It's not only the recovery initiative of last July of a total size of 1.8 trillion that meant to relaunch our economies from this symmetric shock that we have suffered. But it is also our joint program of pre purchasing vaccines from all the companies that are closer to producing one, and giving the absolute certainty to Europeans that they will have access, equitable, fair, and universal access to the vaccines. We have agreed with 6 companies and we have pre purchased 2 billion doses of vaccines for Europeans. So I think this, in a way, sums up the EU response. The EU response was a resolute one, was a convincing one, and we're very happy to be able. President Macron, in his famous Sorbonne speech, called for a Europe that protects. I think there is no better example of a Europe that protects from what Europe did in managing the pandemic in these last months.
We are welcoming back Turkey's presidential spokesman, Ibrahim Kalin. We lost you at the beginning there, sir, so I wanted to readdress the question that we had asked you. In the wake of our pandemic, has the way we think about globalization and the way we approach multilateralism changed forever?
Thank you for the loss of connection there. I think we will see a lot of changes in our perceptions and definitions of these terms: globalization, nation state, the balance between freedom and security, and of course multilateralism, solidarity, and other concepts. Because we are all living in a global moment for the first time in a long time. We've had cases where things have impacted, other parts of the world, such as the stock market crisis in Asia will have impact on markets in Europe and the United States, or say war in Syria or Iraq will have impact on other parts of the world or region. But we never have had a case where one single incident changed almost everything, touched every single aspect of our lives from east to west, from rich countries to poor countries, from south to north. And that will, I believe, have significant consequences for the way we conduct our lives. I think one of the lessons we've learned is that it is possible to live with less. We again have realized, I hope, to the extent that all people, individually and collectively have realized it, that less is more. Less can bring more quality into our lives. Material, quantitative magnitude does not necessarily mean a healthier or happier or more rational life. And I remember the little book that the economist Frederick Schumacher wrote many years ago in the 1970s, called "Small is Beautiful." And I think we're again remembering his legacy, where he said small is beautiful, and his followers and students follow up his work with another book called "Small is Possible." And I think small is possible, less is possible, and it can bring more quality into our lives. And that brings us to the question of what really matters more, what really matters essentially in our lives. And I think nation states, multinational institutions, individuals, other collective bodies are asking this very question today. And one important line of thinking about all this is the legitimacy of international institutions, the way they responded to this crisis, whether it's the United Nations or WHO, whether it is this Organization of Islamic Conference or the EU or other international bodies. They will have to go some changes in terms of increasing their capacities to deal with crises like this, when something like that happens, how they respond, how they protect human lives. And there, I think this will have a huge impact on the way we think about the global order or the so-called liberal global order. But as Voltaire was quoted once about the Holy Roman Empire, when he was asked about it, he said it was neither holy nor Roman nor empire. I think the global liberal global order has never been really liberal or global or even an order. We are facing the consequences of this today, and I think as we go along, we will have a major revision of these very concepts about multiculturalism, multilateralism, solidarity, and other concepts as we go along.
Well, it sounds like we could be redrawing our future map. So let's bring in Parang Khanna here to discuss that further as a strategic advisory firm, Future Map. What do you take from Mr. Cullen's comments there? Do you think we are going to see a complete sort of reshuffle of the way we approach multinationalism and globalization? And what potentially does that mean for interstate conflicts?
Well, there's a lot of questions in there, all of which are very interesting and worth discussing. The first is that globalization is always evolving. It isn't really one fixed pattern of relations. You have economic or migratory, financial, diplomatic, and other kinds of relationships between regions and powers and emerging markets that are shifting all the time. We see that right now happening with global supply chains, for example. One of the important things to observe in the wake of the pandemic is just how rapidly supply chains have been shifting in terms of trade as a result of rising tensions with China. Now, those tensions actually go back quite a few years, the better part of this past decade, and we've already seen the capacity of economies to move capital, move investment to new or safer or more trusted geographies. That's why Southeast Asia, for example, has been something of a beneficiary of the US-China trade war. So what's interesting is that right now we simultaneously have globalization continuing in many ways. Let's remember that sharing the research and innovation around vaccines is itself a form of globalization, correct? In the midst of the shutdown of trade in some areas and borders being closed to migration, we also have countries that are opening their capital accounts, like China, and bringing in more financial flows. So globalization is multi-directional, and the volume increases and decreases all the time. In terms of the geopolitical fault line, there are greater and lesser kinds of situations. In Asia, where I live, Asia is home to most of the world's major conflict scenarios. Just look at Taiwan or North Korea or the South China Sea or the India-China border, India and Pakistan. Most of the conflicts that are really could have systemic impact that involve both the United States and China are very much here in Asia. Now, over the last 30 years, Asians have done a good job of keeping these geopolitical tensions somewhat suppressed as their economies have become more integrated. In other words, they have been pursuing geoeconomic convergence despite the geopolitical tensions. And you can see that, again, despite the fact that we see the heightened tension over Taiwan right now, tensions with China on its borders, these countries still signed the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Trade Agreement just under 2 weeks ago, which is the largest trade liberalization zone in the entire world today as a share of GDP and population. So you can see that there is a pragmatism around the geopolitical tensions to some degree in the case of Asia. I don't think there's any guarantee of that, of course. 30 years is a period of success, of pragmatism, and also some degree of luck. But I would like to see much more active efforts at actual conflict resolution, of conflict settlement, as we've seen in the Caucasus in just the last 2 months. There is no such thing as a frozen conflict. We use these terms sometimes to push conflict away from our headlines and pretend that it is a stable situation. But what's often happening is that forces are preparing for future action, and that can be violent and that can escalate at any given time. So I worry about a fair number of the legacy conflicts, if you will, that date back, some of them centuries, in terms of border tensions, whether it is in the Caucasus, whether it is on the European periphery, most certainly in Asia. And I think we have to make very active efforts to settle those conflicts before they can accidentally flare up, because the last thing that the world economy or a global society can afford right now is an unnecessary conflict.
Well, let's stay on the topic there of security. Margaritas Skinas, as far as the EU goes, what sort of meaningful role can the EU play when we look at advancing a more inclusive international order, maybe when we talk about reforming key institutions like the UN Security Council? Can the EU be a leader in moving forward with the times now?
I have personally no doubt that once we enter post-pandemic times, there will be a renewed drive towards multilateralism. I think Professor Nye already alluded to it. It's inevitable. The world, once out of the pandemic, will rediscover the value of multilateral cooperation and the sense of a stronger, revitalized, more effective, and reformed rules-based multilateral system. I think there will be at the heart of this drive towards multilateralism, you can find many factors. First is that the world will have to go through the green and the digital transition. And since you asked for the EU role, I think we are very proud in Europe to have led by example on the green transition and for having taken commitments that will make Europe the first decarbonized continent on Earth by 2050, to such an extent that even our Chinese friends have now announced that they're moving in the same direction. And we have every reason to believe that the new Biden administration will be a solid player in this, a solid co-player, if you like, in this drive for multilateralism. When it comes to the digital transition, there will be in Europe some questions, serious questions to be asked on areas like artificial intelligence, cybersecurity, the role of technological platforms. And these questions have already been asked and answered in the United States, and we know what kind of answer they got. And in China, they haven't even been asked at all. But when Europe's moment comes, Europe will have to decide if artificial intelligence, for example, will compel us to leave the use of the algorithms in the hands of engineered zoo or in the hands of society and regulators. We will be forced to have a European way of going into new technologies in cybersecurity, 5G, access to data, protection of data, and there will be a European way for the platforms when they operate in Europe to be taxed in Europe, to be playing with the rules of the game that Europe sets. So all these questions would be questions that would be part of this transition and this drive to multilateralism. And finally, I think health will be another driver, because very few people on the planet could ever understand that humanity coming out of such a huge, unprecedented crisis to work in a way which is uncoordinated and segmented in the area of health. I predict that we will see more cooperation around a reformed WHO, and I predict that health will be an avenue for multilateral cooperation in the years to come. In all these areas, I think Europe has nothing to fear. We are, as you know, probably the world's epicenter of soft power. These are areas that we can usefully defend and promote internationally. And I think that the political winds will be favorable for Europe to assume such a role in these areas.
Well, Professor Nye, we heard Mr. Skinner there reiterate your belief that multilateralism isn't dead and gone, it is still in our future. What about protectionism then, though? When we look at countries trying to stockpile vaccines, is there a concern that there is a move towards protectionism, isolationism?
And when somebody is elected to be head of a state, he or she has a responsibility for protecting the national interest. After all, a leader is a trustee for those who have put him or her there. So when you face questions of how do I defend the national interest, you can either define that national interest broadly or narrowly. So, for example, you say, I will protect my people by stockpiling all the vaccines. Well, perhaps that's the first duty, but you can also reserve a portion of those vaccines for other people, particularly for health providers in poor countries or for poor countries which don't have adequate public health systems. And that's where the World Health Organization has established a special facility. Unfortunately, Donald Trump defined the American national interest very narrowly, and we did not join that. But on the other hand, I think you may see Biden joining it. There is a tradition in the United States, which I describe in my book on Do Morals Matter, of defining the national interest in ways which good for us and good for others at the same time. A good example of that is, of course, the Marshall Plan, in which American support for Europe, which was quite extensive, more than 2% GDP per year, American support for Europe was done in America's national interest, but it was good for Europeans at the same time. In the same sense, supporting poor countries, public health systems, is in our national interest because a reservoir of pandemic viruses in the southern half of the globe, which spills back seasonally into the northern half of the globe, is a threat to us. But it's also a good thing for us to do to help those countries because not just of our national interest, but out of a humanitarian concern. And when you define your national interest broadly, not just narrowly, that helps engender your soft power or your ability to attract others. So, yes, there will be a protectionism. There is right now, but it doesn't have to be all or nothing.
We've had a couple of references there to soft power. Mr. Skinner, you mentioned it, and Professor Nye, you have too. So let me ask you, Mr. Cannan, what you believe is going to be the future of soft power as we move into the next phase of this COVID-19 pandemic. As you say, you're in Asia. Some commentators have said that China's example of showing their eagerness to participate in the COVAX scheme is an example of China trying to exert some soft power. How do you see soft power being played out now?
Well, China's virus diplomacy has had positive and negative aspects. First of all, of course, China's image in the region and the suspicion around China has only grown considerably as a result of the domestic suppression of information, which of course included international not sharing information internationally about the pandemic. So if you live in Asia and on the periphery of China, which several billion people do, it's hard to not be highly suspicious of China. And that is now, I believe, a permanent psychological condition in the region. And I think we have to be very clear and honest about that. So every effort that China makes to enhance its credibility in the eyes of the rest of the world, that is really an attempt to regain trust. And the question as to whether or not that's working is highly dubious in my opinion, based upon what I see around the region. So the fact that China is trying to take a key role in vaccine development and has been conducting what some call mask diplomacy and its sharing of medical equipment and so forth, all of this is really just trying to compensate in some ways. Now, let's bear in mind at the same time, we cannot separate what's happening in COVID diplomacy from the other dimensions of China's diplomacy, the wolf warriors, as they're known, and China's aggression in its statements and its policies and its trade embargoes and other measures towards countries like Australia, for example. These are really grabbing the headlines as well. So I think it will be a very long uphill battle for China to regain trust in the light of the simultaneous unfolding of the COVID pandemic, as well as its trade and security policies in the region. And I think that now is a fairly, consensus global view, if you will. So again, the what's happening with the virus sort of development, vaccine development, cannot really be separated from the broader question of the global heightened global suspicion about China based on all of these other factors as well.
Let's move off soft power a little bit to something that we mentioned earlier on when we just had a couple of mentions of climate change. So I want to go back to you, Bisera Turkovic, and ask if nationalism is the enemy of these global challenges, such as climate change. You have a background also in the nuclear energy field about nuclear non-proliferation. Is nationalism the enemy of that? How do we increase our cooperation to find viable solutions to these problems?
I believe that increasing cooperation is the conditio sine qua non for finding answers to many questions. Living in Europe, it is very difficult not to look from this angle, and clearly the international role of the EU has been evolving in the past few years. The international order has been shattered in historical way. Also, it applies to nuclear power as well. The return of geopolitics has challenged the EU's self-conception as normative power. The market economy crisis has deepened inequalities and populism. And climate change and the environmental threats loom over the world as we know it. I doubt that Atomic Energy Agency can help much in questions which are put forward in front of all of us. And if you add COVID-19 pandemic, which raise many questions about geopolitical balance and how the world's strongest economies will look like after the dangerously unique global economic recession. We are coming to a really complicated situation which is raising many important questions. It is important to address how will the distribution of geopolitical power change in the post-pandemic world? Will it impact the EU transformative power and its leading role as a global player, and how far it is going to go? Is the EU going to have more geoeconomic priorities than geopolitical ambitions? And it's applied to the rest of the world, of course. How does the EU's more geopolitical agenda and principled paradigms and pragmatism intersect with the EU's value-laden legitimation processes, and many other questions which are really very detrimental, especially for us living in Western Balkan. What approach should it adopt towards key neighbors, Russia, Turkey, and China? Should the EU offer a European perspective to its eastern neighbors? How will the EU define its role in the NATO? How can it step up its support for effective multilateralism against the backdrop of US disruption? Should it promote and support multilateralism where feasible while adjusting the power politics and real politics whenever it is more beneficial? Just to mention a few of those questions, we need to put extra emphasis on developing cooperation mechanism in all domains, in other domains as well when it comes to nuclear power, and not to mention only those difficult items, but even when we are discussing about enhance exchange of information, methodological and procedural knowledge, medical research findings, health records, clinical skills, all that needs much, much more cooperation, much more openness, and we need really to restructure our current situation in order to be in a more friendly term and helping and recognizing needs of each other.
Another big global issue, undoubtedly, is migration. Mr. Skinas, how might rising nationalism, which we have seen across Europe, impact the collective will of the EU member states to develop a comprehensive approach to migration?
Yes, I think that the time has come for Europe to produce a holistic framework for migration policy. To me, it's unthinkable that Europe, that accounts for a market that produces around 25% of the global GDP, that represents the second world currency of reference, that is a powerhouse in many respects, still does not have a single holistic, cohesive migration policy. What we're having now is rather a patchwork of different regulatory solutions that produce very unequal and normally negative results that we can see in Lesbos, in the Greek islands, in the Canary Islands, in Calais, in the Balkans. We need a reset on European migration policy. On the 23rd of September, together with my colleague, Commissioner for Home Affairs, we have presented for the first time a new departure, a new proposal for an European pact for asylum and migration. This is now being discussed by our member states and the European Parliament. It is high time to do this and do it right. This proposal will have three elements. The first element would be an external dimension that would compel us to work closer and better with our neighbors and the countries of origin and transit of migratory flows. The second component will be a much more effective management of our external border with a new European border and coast guard, which is being created and reinforced. And the final element would be a system of solidarity and burden sharing between our member states, because it will be totally unfair to leave the countries of first reception to shoulder a disproportionate part of the burden of managing asylum uh, in Europe. We are confident that this time we will have an agreement. We are very much now actively involved in this, and I will also like to make a final point on this point, if you like, that we feel that now, it's because of the pandemic, the migratory flows are lower and the pressure is not as high as it was back in 2016. Europe now probably has an opportunity to find this agreement easier. As someone would say, one has to fix the roof when it's not raining. And probably this is the moment for Europe to do it. Allow me make also a
Well,
point, since I see my friend Rael Kalin here in this panel, to acknowledge the role of Turkey of migration and migration flows. Turkey is host to the biggest number of refugees in the world, of course, with our support, and we very much hope that this close cooperation can also continue in the future.
you preempted my question there, because we cannot talk about migration in Europe if we don't talk about Turkey. Mr. Cullen, I am sure that Turkey is eagerly awaiting, as Mr. Skinner says, a more comprehensive migration program from Europe. What do you think? Is this rise of nationalism across Europe a concern for Turkey when we talk about this migration crisis?
Yes, migration has been one of the key components of global crises over the last couple of decades, but most pressingly from Syria in the last 5, 6 years, especially. We are hosting, as Mr. Skinner pointed out, the largest number of refugees from anywhere in the world, 4 million. We are also taking care of about 3.5 million Syrians on the Syrian side, and other people in the areas where close to the Turkish border, where we are helping them. Definitely, the international support and burden sharing has been very disappointing. Our agreement with EU is a good one. It's a good working platform. But unfortunately, if you compare it to the enormity of the problem, the health, actual physical health that has been very little, insufficient. And also, to be honest with you, the record of European countries and some rich countries in the world in tackling the crisis, the refugee crisis over the last 5, 6 years, has been really a dismal record. The largest, the most prosperous and richest countries in the world have done mostly to keep the refugees out from their borders, from their cities, rather than to address the issue. And that brings me to a point Professor Nye raised in his comments earlier, where he said defining national interest in a narrow manner will be, in fact, against the national interest of any country, of any society. I fully agree with this principle that it will be self-defeating to define one's national interest or self-interest in a very narrow and maximalist manner, because we live in this age of growing interdependence where, for example, in terms of security, none of us are safe until all of us are safe. Uh, None of us can share in the wealth and prosperity or safety of the world until all of us share these values. So me first, my country first, my region first approach is very much self-defeating in this age of interdependence and multilateralism. And in principle, solidarity means going out beyond interest, means going beyond your own narrow national interest or personal self-interest. It means genuine openness to others. And the moral principle there should be to help others as an end in and of itself, without any regard for profit or long-term gains or calculations and the like. But we know the reality is not like this. The current global order is run by the most powerful countries in the world, which tend to be very unfair and greedy when it comes to these issues. And here, I have to raise a couple of points about multilateralism and Eurocentrism, how it is defined in a very Eurocentric context. Multilateralism means that more than one or two countries participate in an effort to help each other or address a regional issue. But multilateralism is uh, recognized only when uh, prominent Western European countries are part of the process. If, say, for example, Japan, China, and South Korea do something, and somehow some Western countries are absent, it really doesn't count as multilateralism. Multilateralism means that yeah, powerful European nations or the United States must be part of it. Otherwise, it's not multilateralism. That needs to change because I believe at the end of the day, Eurocentrism hurts European interests and Western nations as well. Uh, and self, uh, uh, if the rich and powerful countries of the world remain unfair and greedy in dealing with global crises and issues, global chaos and injustice will only increase. And what I call the clash lobby will win. I don't know if there is a clash of civilizations going on, but there is certainly a lobby or a number of lobbyists working, to make it happen or to give the impression that there is this global war, there is this global clash, this collusion is about to happen, so that they can take advantage of this situation. Uh, we have to address these issues, I think, in an honest manner. If you are going to address the international global order in the post-pandemic world, when we reach there, when we called for a reform of international institutions such as the UN, such as, for example, our President Erdogan, calling for a reform of the UN Security Council. When he says the world is bigger than five, he is referring to this self-proclaimed structure, institutional organization at the UN, where everything is blocked, everything is dependent on the views of the five countries, and you look at whether it is fair geographically, fair demographically. It's not, of course. It's a very old, ancient structure that is not able to address the pressing issues of the 21st century. Uh, we need to talk about these issues now in a much more serious and earnest manner in the 21st century. Otherwise, injustice, greed, unfairness, all these problems will continue and deepen the problems, whether it is the refugee crisis or poverty or inequality or injustices or wars, migration, and number of other issues. Yes, Trump may be out of office, but I think Trumpism will continue to live on within the mindset of many institutions around the world, not just in the United States, but in other countries as well. Therefore, if we are going to address multilateralism in a genuine manner, I think we have to take all this into account. We have seen the failure of the international system in Syria, in the Syrian war. We have seen it in Iraq with the political chaos. We have seen it in Yemen, in Somalia, in the Palestinian question, in a number of other parts of the world. And these issues, add up to this ongoing, permanent global conflict, one after another, and that clearly creates a lot of space for what I call the clash lobby, which then manipulates a sense of identity, uh, fosters populism, even encourages fascism, authoritarianism in other parts of the world. And that is not a good thing for anyone, for either Eastern countries or Western countries, for rich or poor countries, because if the world is stuck in this kind of chaos, everybody's affected by it. And another pandemic, God forbid, another COVID-20, COVID-21 or something of that magnitude will make things even worse for all of us. So to avert all this, we really have to work together and do it in a really selfless, in the true sense of the term. Do it with genuine openness to others, so that we can help others, we can help ourselves.
Mr. Skinas, I'm going to open it up there for a right of reply to you. Some strong comments from Mr. Cullen. What do you think about some of the issues he's raised, essentially about Eurocentrism, those sorts of ideas?
First of all, I agree. I think we all agree in the panel that the post-pandemic world will lead us to more multilateralism. And the change in the United States and the incoming Biden administration would be a key element for that, together with everything that I had the chance to explain earlier, namely the green transition and the role of Europe will play in fostering better governance of the digital realities, artificial intelligence, and health cooperation. So there we agree. I do not quite agree, and the term, although it's a Greek term, of Eurocentrism. In fact, I haven't come across this term before Mr. Kalin used it. Look, the European Union and its member states are the biggest donors of development aid in the world. No one contributes much more in terms of development aid than we do in Africa, in Asia, in the poorest areas of the planet. We have free trade with the nothing but arms with the poorer countries of the planet. We are leading by example in noble causes for the planet, like climate change and the Paris Agreement. This is not Eurocentric. This is totally the contrary. It's Europe taking the lead to help the world. Recently, we have presided a donors conference that raised 16 billion euros for vaccines development and therapeutics for the rest of the world beyond what we're doing within the EU, especially in these areas of the world where we have more fragile health systems. And we are one of the most ardent supporters of COVAX in this clear area, working with COVAX and G20 to step up contribution worldwide. So I do not see all this as being Eurocentric. Of course, I agree also with Mr. Kalin that the international system failed to address certain problems. Syria, Libya are good examples. But the logical conclusion of this failure is not that it's Europe's fault or it's anyone's fault. I would say that this is the most compelling factor to move towards multilateralism, effective cooperative solutions that involve everybody else. So a mixed bag in terms of reaction from me on this one.
One thing that both of you gentlemen did comment on was Trumpism. So let me ask you, Professor Nye, Trump, as we all know, is out, but is Trumpism out? Can the incoming President Biden afford to scrap America first and reset America's international policy? Will that be accepted, do you think?
Well, as I mentioned before, the term America first is not bad per se. I would imagine Macron says France first. But I think the problem is how narrowly Trump defined America first, that it was always short run and transactional and didn't include the interests of others. I think what we've heard this morning from all the panelists is that, in fact, there are times when helping others is in your own interest. And I think you're going to see a greater realization of that when Biden takes office. I know many of the people who are close to him, Tony Blinken, the designee for Secretary of State, and Jake Sullivan, and so forth. They are able to see American interests in this broader framework. I think the question of will there still remain Trumpism? Yes. Populism and a narrow interpretation of one's tribe, so to speak, is endemic in all societies. And there is a group in the United States which will urge the narrow interpretation of the national interest. Fortunately, that's not the majority. And while the Biden administration will be limited by control of the Senate by the Republican Party, it's not totally certain until the elections in January in Georgia for 2 Senate seats. But let's suppose that they remain a Republican. That will limit his capacities in domestic policy, not so much in foreign policy. The American Constitution gives a good deal more leeway to presidents in foreign policy. So I think you will see, yes, a residual Trumpism, or if you want, call it a narrow populistic approach. I liked this term Mr. Collin used about the clash lobby. I think that's a nice way of caricaturing them. That will exist. It's going to exist in the United States. It's going to exist in other countries. I don't think it's going to prevent the Biden administration from turning to a much more multilateral interpretation of American national interests.
Parang Khanna, let me ask you off the back of that then, do you think that the world is willing to see the return of the US as a bit of a guiding light as far as global politics goes? Have they lost the trust of the world, and will they be willing to open their arms again to global leadership on behalf of the USA?
I think we tend to view the US far too much as a fluctuating presence in the world based upon the news cycle or based upon our views of the occupant of the White House. The truth is that, on a 24/7, 365 day in and day out basis, the United States plays an incredibly in-depth, far-reaching role in many important parts of the world and most of the world. And that's true in Asia, that's true in Europe, and so forth. So if we ignore for a moment the image or impression that we draw from the news, let's not forget the role of the American financial system, the American military, and so many aspects of what comes out of American decision-making and policy and its global presence and its impact on the world. So that doesn't necessarily mean leadership per se, but a lot of people, I think we should not confuse presence with leadership. I think America's presence is ubiquitous still in so many important areas. Whether or not as a leader is a different question. And there, I think it's a worthwhile issue. I think that what is happening in the world more broadly and has been happening for a long time is a certain sense of awakening and desire of regions, most certainly in Europe, most certainly in Asia, these wealthy, confident corners of the world, to be in control of their own fate, to make their own decisions, to exercise their own sovereignty, to decide what the best manner in which they are going to relate to their neighbors is. And one sees that playing out, again, most profoundly in Europe and in Asia. And I think that that's an important trend. And I think that is irrevocable. So rather than view the issue as whether or not the world as a whole, as if we can generalize, will welcome back America, I think we should be looking at these bottom-up realities that are actually quite robust Again, it's the rising self-confidence of regions to try to determine their own fate. And then the question for America becomes, to what extent is it listening? Is it contributing? Is it helping those regions achieve what it is that they want to achieve for themselves? And I think that's the question that needs to be asked in Washington.
Do you think America is
and
listening? Are they receiving?
Well, again, there isn't really one global answer to that question, right? When you look at the role of America's military, for example, or sanctions policy, there are going to be geographies and partners with whom that is still remains very important and where there is consensus and agreement. And there's going to be areas of huge disagreement. And again, between the United States and Europe, there are areas where they cooperate very strongly. And as we've seen in just the last few days, European leaders, the European Union, has issued something of an action plan to guide future cooperation around issues like technology, regulation, and also screening of investment from China and these kinds of things. So there's enormous scope for cooperation in the transatlantic arena. There are still very strong American relations with Asian powers. In fact, they're only getting stronger if we look at the level or the renewal of cooperation between the United States, Japan, and Australia, and India now playing a growing role as well in what we call the Quad set of countries. So I would very strongly resist us having one global answer to the question, but I want us to think about how the answers to future problems lie very much in the regions themselves. And I would like to see, again, U.S. policy focus on supporting those palatable, ground-up, inside-out solutions. That is the recipe for a more stable world.
Well, let's get a bit more specific then. Mr. Cullen, as you have mentioned, President Erdogan regularly says the world is bigger than five. What would Turkey's reaction be to the return of active global leadership by the US president, which we have seen a lack of during the Trump administration?
Well, it's not just about one country coming back. Of course, the US remains the most powerful nation in the world, and the current global architecture is something like one superpower with a number of great powers around it, and then other middle powers, the pyramid going something like this. And this has been more or less like this since the end of the Cold War. But that has not brought peace or stability or justice to the global scale, to the global scene, whether the U.S. was run by a kind of a more internationalist, democratic president, or more America First type, Republican president. We haven't seen this having this kind of, a really positive impact on a global scale. Other things I think need to change. It's not just, as I said, who sits in the White House. Yes, there will be a difference, no doubt, from Trump administration to Biden administration. I'm sure it will be felt and seen in a number of areas. But my point is that the entire global system itself is marred by so many imperfections. It cannot be fixed by a change in one country, whether it's the U.S. Or in any other country, say even among the five permanent members of the Security Council at the UN. That structure itself needs to change. Otherwise, again, everything will be unbalanced, and this equilibrium will continue to fuel regional conflicts. The regional conflicts will become scenes and theaters for global power politics, and the little ones will continue to suffer, as we have seen in Syria, Iraq, Yemen, Palestine, Libya, and many other places. The question is, of course, is the world willing as a whole to address these issues, come together, work in a true sense of solidarity and multilateralism? As I said, my experience in all of this, I've been involved in all of this talk, from Syria to Libya, from Karabakh, Azerbaijan, to many other conflicts. Multilateralism sometimes is just a cover for one nation, one country imposing its own agenda. And I know it's a fact, but when we work together really in a genuine manner, then we make progress in addressing these issues. whether it's the refugee crisis, or it's the fight against terrorism, or other cross-national issues. I think we will see more calls for a reform of the international order, where justice, equality, these principles will not be just words, but they will be actionable principles on the basis of which we can build a better world where no one is privileged over others because of their nationality or religion or ethnicity or geography. And I hope we will all work, towards this goal as we go through this COVID-19 crisis. One other issue, for example, another pressing issue that will, I think, bring us all together, whether we like it or not, is the issue of security. I don't mean just political or military security. What I mean is, probably I can sum them up under three main areas of security. Number one is biosecurity. We have seen how significant this is. Biological weapons can be so deadly. And again, they don't recognize any borders. And we have seen with the COVID-19, a little virus, invisible, can cause so much suffering and an economic loss and contraction of the entire global system. Biosecurity cannot be addressed only by one country or one group of nations. It will have to be dealt with on a global scale so that we can take precautions to provide security, biosecurity for everyone. Number two is food security, which is very much related to this. Just imagine this COVID crisis continues for 3 years, 5 years like this with major lockdowns. We're going to face serious food security problems. We haven't faced it now. We are dealing with it, I think, on a global scale in a fairly reasonable manner. But for each nation as well as for regions, food security will remain a key issue as we go along. And the last one here, again, which will, I think, force all of us to cooperate with one another, is cybersecurity. As we do more and more stuff now on the cyberspace out of necessity, as we are doing this panel, but many other things. State business is run now on cyber channels, banking and financial transactions, health issues, international meetings, and so much is being done on the cyberspace that we will need a deeper and more comprehensive cooperation on cybersecurity. All these things force us to work together. But as I said, I want to underline the significance of the role that the richer countries, more powerful countries in the world will have to play in this struggle as we go along. If they seek justice and act according to the principle of protecting the other and holding the principle of justice, and then I think we will have a better run on making the world order more humane, based on principles of justice and compassion for all.
Mr. Cullen, when you mentioned cybersecurity, Mr. Skinas, you nodded your head very vigorously there. The world now, as Mr. Cullen said, is conducting so much business, as we are here today, virtually. What challenges has that brought forward? And Mr. Skinas, as far as the EU goes, what challenges lie ahead for corporations, for governments to take this as a positive and really move this forward into 2021 and beyond?
Before the start of the pandemic, we have calculated that in the European Union, we lack about 300,000 digital workers that our companies require and that we do not actually have. During the pandemic, we continue to have this need. We need to find these people, and we'll see how. But one of the gains of the pandemic is that the society at large from schools, kids at elementary schools, until grannies at home, our societies familiarized themselves with their digital realities, and we had an incredible gain in terms of familiarizing our population with online tools, teaching, learning, finding information, organizing market, the economy, prosperity, and so on and so forth. So what we need to do in the future is make the best of this achievement, but continue to strive for more digital skills and more digital knowledge in Europe. And it's an urgent need now. Europe needs a skills revolution, and we'll make sure that in the years to come, through our training programs, but also through other means like legal migration or international cooperation, we can find these people. And on the macro level, as I was telling you before, and that's why I was noting when Mr. Kalim mentioned cybersecurity, I think that it's Europe's moment to decide on these mega issues like the future of platforms in Europe, the way we protect ourselves from attacks from state and non-state actors and hybrid threats, the way that the many enemies that the pandemic has brought around can use the system to go through our cracks to produce miracle cures, misinformation, shape the way our societies vote, affect our democracies. All these are issues that we need to see in the years to come. And I use the term we because, of course, this is mainly a European concern, but all these areas are areas where we, the planet, would have a lot to gain if we were to meet with other like-minded forces. And I really hope, my real hope is that this will be possible in the years to come.
Mr. Cullen also highlighted a lot of other security issues, not just military security, things like food security, biosecurity. Mr. Kana, do you think post-pandemic it has changed the way the world is going to need to address securing things like water, like food, like its biosecurity? Has this forced the world to really take stock?
Well, not only the pandemic, but also obviously climate change. We've had a growing frequency of droughts, extreme weather events, and other climate-related disasters. Some of the largest food-producing countries in the world will struggle in the next 5 to 10 years if they don't already to maintain food output. The way this ties to the pandemic is that, as we saw, countries such as Russia, Kazakhstan, Vietnam, and others temporarily suspended the export of staple crops and commodities, wheat, rice, and so forth, during the pandemic. Not only were there border closures anyway, but there are concerns sometimes about the stability of their own yield. So climate change, the pandemic, supply chains, and these frictions have all been coming together in a very dangerous situation. And some of the solutions actually do involve greater localization, more self-reliance. And what we're seeing is a number of countries learning that rather than continue to urbanize and build cities further onto arable land, they should actually allow more land for farming, for crop cultivation, to have better technology so that they can be more efficient in terms of water usage, for irrigation. All of these things can actually help us to increase our local food production and decrease the global agricultural supply chains, which are actually a major contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. So I think you're correct to link this issue around the pandemic and the environment and agriculture, and we have to have a sort of systems view of what the solutions are. And the way in which globalization and connectivity relate to all of this is that we do have the technologies to have far more localized renewable power production like solar power and wind power, and to implement some of these agricultural solutions as well. However, it requires that technology be transferred, that knowledge be shared, and that the funding or credit be made available to farmers. And all of these are actually positive examples of how globalization can help us, in a way, how globalization can help us to deglobalize, ironically perhaps, but to deglobalize in ways that are actually beneficial for the climate. Just look at the energy trade, hydrocarbon energy, oil and gas. Do we need to have so much oil put on tankers and sailed around the world? Not really, not if we are investing more in renewable power at the local or national level. So I think that there is this dynamic between the good dimensions of globalization and how they can help local societies be more resilient in the future.
I want to ask that same question to you, Professor Nye, as well, calling on what Mr. Khanna said there. How has this pandemic made the world reassess its global reliance on things like food and energy security? Is it forcing countries to take a step back and think, how can we better look after ourselves?
Well, I agree very much with what Mr. Khanna said. I think the pandemic is, we were slow to wake up, but it was in that sense a wake-up call, that there are different aspects of globalization, some of which are beneficial and some of which are not. We've learned that there are certain areas where efficiency, just having a supply chain that gets you a slightly cheaper cost to your product, is not always crucial if you have to have security. And so we will see increased efforts to look at security in some of the economic supply chains. But that doesn't mean you drop international trade as a whole, which would be a huge loss for the planet. In the sense of the efficiency is not the only gain, but it does make a difference in the long run as to people's welfare. After all, if you look at what's happened to global poverty in the era of globalization over the last 50 years or so, it's greatly declined. People don't always pay attention to that, but there has been progress. But we also have to realize that with greater interconnection comes greater vulnerability, and it makes sense for people to pay attention to security against those vulnerabilities. So I think what Mr. Khanna said is correct. We're going to have to learn to distinguish between some aspects of globalization which are good and some aspects of globalization which have negative side effects. And we're going to have to cooperate to deal with those side effects. And pandemics and climate change are top of the list.
Professor Nye, do you think that the world perhaps would have been slower to understand or to identify these vulnerabilities if it wasn't thrown in our face in this awful pandemic like we've been experiencing?
Oh, I think the pandemic has been an accelerant of people's learning and attitudes. We don't want to pretend that the world changed overnight. After all, there was a movement to deal with climate, which was growing in strength, particularly among younger generations. And if you look at the difference of the progress between, let's say, the Copenhagen meeting in 2009 on climate, which was something of a mess, and the Paris Climate Accords in 2015, there was always some progress occurring ahead of time. I think what you're seeing, though, is that the pandemic has brought this to the forefront that we're going to have to do more. It's been an accelerant or a dramatization of our interdependence. But let's not pretend that there wasn't already movement going on before 2020.
And just as we near the end of our session, just some final closing thoughts. First of all, to you, Mr. Skinas, despite the absolute horrors of this pandemic, what do you think have been some of the positives that the EU can take out of it with regards to its interconnectivity with the rest of the world?
Well, I think you gave the answer yourself to your question. I think probably for us, one of the most positive outcomes of this tragedy was that always in times of crisis, Europeans feel that they are better together. The biggest enemy of the European Union is complacency and stagnation. Each time that we have external shocks that produce uncertainty in our public opinion, in our member states, very quickly member states, being big or small, east or west, regardless of the political cleavage on which they find themselves, they all very quickly understand that their main leverage, their shield, if you like, is an effective European Union approach. This happened in the past on many occasions. I can remind you of the food crisis in the 19th, of the mad cow disease and the dioxin crisis. Then with the economic and financial crisis, same thing. And now with the pandemic, exactly the same pattern. So the value of cooperation and working together is the positive. And I want to finish these words thanking you again for having me and expressing my gratitude for this panel by saying that this force of the European Union will not be Eurocentric. Let me assure you of this. This is a force, a political capital that we will spend in favor of a rules-based multilateral system. This is not only for us, it's for the benefit of us as part of a wilder, more vibrant, more fair world around us. Thank you again.
Thank you. And with only about 5 minutes left, let me put that question to you, Ibrahim Cullen. Again, despite the atrocities of this pandemic and the incredibly unfortunate loss of life, what positives does Turkey take out of it with regards to global interconnectivity?
Well, one important lesson I think we've all learned from this is the significance of keeping the balance between self-sufficiency and international solidarity. Each nation wants to be self-sufficient on all the key fundamental issues, and that's their right, and I think they should strive for it. But we have also seen that it's just not possible to be self-reliant on everything. And self-sufficiency doesn't mean that you close yourself up to the rest of the world. You open up, you help, you cooperate, you interact, you develop things together. And the vaccine work and other health-related issues have shown once again how significant it is to keep these lines of multilateralism and solidarity open, efficient, working, so that we can all benefit from this. But again, to do this on a sustainable basis, we will have to change the dynamics, the fundamental principles upon which the current global order is based. It needs really a radical rethinking of how the world should be functioning, a world order should be functioning. And one last point, and this is one of the downsides of this process, the sense of insecurity that came with the pandemic. And the heightened sense of going to the public order, asking public officials and the nation states to do X, Y, Z to protect the lives of people, which is a natural reaction that's quite understandable, has also given rise, more fuel to the rising tide of populism, xenophobia, and other related viruses that have infected our world of globalization for the last 2, 3, 4 decades, even more. Therefore, as we go through this process, I think we need to be vigilant against the viruses of xenophobia, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and other types of racism and discrimination, which is becoming more and more mainstream, taking hostage of mainstream European politics, and other parts of the world. Any kind of ethnocentrism that pits one group of people against another on the basis of religion, ethnicity, color, or cultural differences or preferences should be avoided, and this should be addressed in a serious manner, because we live in an age in which perceptions matter more than reality, and the way people perceive, the other cultures, other societies, other countries or geographies, shapes the way policies are made, shapes the way people's lives are affected by this policy. So we have to be spending more time on this as we go through this pandemic.
Parang Khanna, if with just a couple of minutes remaining, what can you sum up with regards to any benefits that you think the world has seen with regards to reminding the world of how perhaps they are stronger together?
Well, there's no question, and let's just look at how the acceleration of digital connectivity, right, and certainly our appreciation and our reliance on it at a time when international mobility dropped to almost zero. And let's remember that itself, even though the international lockdown, as it were, was not a perfect act of coordination, far from it. It certainly was the most ambitious, rapidly coordinated international action that's ever really taken place. And so it shows that we have that capacity to communicate and to recognize what needs to be done. Again, even if it's not implemented evenly, it was a great test. And I think that, again, the expansion, the rapid deployment of digital communication tools, such as the ones we're using right now, the efforts that governments will make to ensure that citizens, that individuals have access to mobile payments, mobile communications, data, public information that's necessary in situations like this. There are obviously some very positive, lessons and policies that will emerge from this pandemic, and I think that we should make sure to have those not be politicized and to focus on empowering people as much as possible with these tools. So I do see that as one of the silver linings, if you will.
And Bisera Turkovic, we've had some trouble with your connection, but hopefully we can still hear you. If you can give us very briefly what you believe some of the positives of global connectivity has come out of this pandemic.
Well, I think that the ongoing pandemic has challenged the globalization and cohesion in many ways. It's created fractions among the states, undermined social convergence, and tested intergenerational solidarity. However, this extraordinary situation reconfirms the necessity of further enhancing cooperation within not only region where we are living, where I'm living, but beyond, in between states and between continents. It is the only way how we should do.
So many interesting points raised. I really appreciate your time. Thank you to our expert panel. It's been an incredibly interesting discussion. We've very much appreciated having your time here on the TRT World Forum. That's it from me, Melinda Nusafora. And now let me leave you with some thoughts from our very dear friend and colleague, Elif Bereketli.